Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce our luncheon keynote speaker.
Sorry, I left this up here.
At age 8, Terrace Grescoe decided that his Vancouver, British Columbia residential street had too many cars chugging past. So he took out his monopoly houses and hotels and modeled what his city block would look like without any cars at all. Quote, "I was an 8-year-old urban planning geek in the making." I think a lot of us in the room can relate to that. While his career took a different path than urban planning, those early transportation experiences shaped a worldview that Grescoe outlines in his latest book, Straphanger. The author of nonfiction essays and books including Bottomfeeder, How to Eat Ethically in a World of Vanishing Seafood, Grescoe is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, The Independent, and National Geographic Traveler, and has written for Gourmet, Salon, and Wired. Please join me in welcoming Terrace Grescoe.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to this great conference in this great city. It's always a pleasure to come to Portland. Yesterday, I'm from Montreal. I live in Montreal, by the way. And when I was invited here, I had to realize I had to go meet Jarrett Walker, the great transit blogger. And he invited me yesterday to his place in Southeast Portland, and he invited me for brunch. So I asked him, are we going to have eggs? And if so, will the chicken have a name? And he said, I know Portland. And it turned out that indeed the chicken had a name. The name was Golda, and the eggs were delicious. So Portland so far has lived up to all my expectations. I'm from Montreal, but I grew up in Vancouver, so I spent a lot of time coming here when I was young. And this city always reminds me of Vancouver in the 1970s, when it was actually kind of nice to live and affordable to live in Vancouver. It's kind of like going back to a wonderful past. But I mean, I'm not saying that you're Vancouver in the 70s. You're a very different city now, but it's a city that's wonderful to visit. So now that I've finished kissing ass, I'm going to talk a little bit about my latest book. And I'm here to tell you that I'm a straphanger, and I'm proud to be one. But first, I better explain what that means exactly. Straphanger is a term that's not used a lot on the West Coast. It's still used a lot in London and New York, and it means a user of public transportation. Someone who's crammed onto a double-decker bus or a Hong Kong ferry or a Paris metro car, and usually because it's crowded, forced to hold a strap, hence straphanger. There's a great organization called the Straphangers Campaign in New York that advocates for public transit still. I have a somewhat broader definition. For me, being a straphanger can mean being a cyclist or a pedestrian, because in many cities, bicycles are a form of mass transportation, and every transit trip begins with a walk to or from school or work or home. Being a straphanger, once again, according to my personal definition, means you don't rely on a private automobile for your day-to-day travel. Personally, I've managed to reach my mid-40s without ever owning an automobile. Of course, I use cars. I belong to a car share program in Montreal, our version of Zipcar. And I even worked as a professional driver once. I still make sure my driver's license is paid up every year. And I do use cars occasionally. But for 95% of my travel, I go by foot, train, my own bicycle, or Montreal's bike share program, or subway, or the metro as it's called in Montreal. For some people, the fact that I ride transit and don't own a car makes me one pathetic individual. That's a quote from Salvador Dalí. Now, I've been to his castle in Catalonia, and I saw his collection of Cadillacs. But look at this, something I dug up on the internet. There is the divine Dalí coming out of a Paris metro station. And of course, because he's a surrealist, he's walking his pet anteater. But still, busted, Dalí on transit. Another well-known commentator set the loser bar even lower. This is a quote that's been attributed to Margaret Thatcher. Now, the closest I could come to finding her on a bus is this. It's not her, of course. It's Meryl Streep. The real Iron Lady wouldn't be caught dead on a bus. And may she rest in peace. As far as I'm concerned, elitist snobs like them can have their chauffeured limousines. 3 years ago, I decided to embrace the maligned identity of the Straphanger for this book I was working on. I set out on a round-the-world voyage, looking at the best and worst in urban and intercity transportation. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I saw and learned along the way. First, though, I got to make this argument. Why do our cities need more and better public transit? Simply put, private automobiles no longer work as a form of mass transportation. In the United States, according to the Texas Transportation Institute, congestion costs the economy $150 billion a year in wasted gas and time. 3.5 million Americans now qualify as extreme commuters, spending 3 or more hours a day getting to and from work. Gas prices have had their ups and downs lately, but in the long term, the oil we have left is getting harder and far dirtier to get out of the ground. After electricity generation, automobiles and trucks and motorcycles are among the largest contributors to greenhouse gases, maybe up to 10% of greenhouse gases. Electric cars might be an improvement if half the electricity on this continent wasn't generated by burning coal. So in my opinion, a continent-wide fleet of Leafs and Volts would be a global warming disaster. By the way, don't even get me started about what many people seem to think is a great hope for solving congestion, autonomous cars. I hope I'm offending about half the people in the room right now. I don't believe the future lies in driverless cars. On the contrary, I believe the future should be all about carless drivers. In other words, pedestrians, straphangers, and cyclists. But for me, the real issue is that the future of the world is urban. Half of the global population already lives in cities, and that proportion is increasing, and cars just aren't going to fit. There's an image from Hyderabad. When it comes to automobiles in the city, it's a classic case of the tragedy of the commons. An apparent incremental increase in individual freedom, owning a car, leads to a diminishing of the commons for everybody. In this case, public space, which is one of the most precious things our cities have to offer. By the way, this is how I've started to think of my car use. So it's a little bit like junk food. I know I'm never going to cut out fatty foods, salty foods completely, but the less I eat of them, the better. I think with cars, as with junk food, you're better off if your keyword is moderation. That, in short, is my argument for transit. Not that it's noble to ride it or always pleasant. Far from it. It's because it's the only thing that's going to keep our people moving in the cities of the future. Now listen, I'm no rail fan, and I'm not a train spotter or a foamer or whatever else, other derogatory terms they have for people who love trains. But I do consider a train ride to be one of life's great pleasures. I'm enough of a geek to respond to what I've come to think of as transit glamour. So without any further ado, here are some of the most amazing things I saw in my travels. First of all, modern European trams. This is an image I took in Strasbourg, a city on the French-German border. The city largely banished cars from its historic center while making these cheap and frequent streetcars a de facto mode of transportation. I was there one Saturday afternoon, and I was amazed to see the way these trams delivered people downtown. Wave after wave of people, shoppers. City Hall and local merchants initially wanted to build a subway system. Instead, they invested in these great low-floor streetcars. As you can see, they're very easy for people in wheelchairs to get on. There are mothers with strollers wheeling their strollers onto the streetcars. Toronto, by the way, which has one of the remaining historic streetcar fleets in North America, the legacy ones, is replacing a lot of its high streetcars, the ones you have to kind of climb up into, with streetcars similar to this, the Flexity Outlook streetcars. There'll be 200 of them arriving next year. What cities like Strasbourg, Montpellier, Bordeaux, and Clermont-Ferrand, here's another one, by the way, in Montpellier. There are now 20 cities in France with these systems. What they have done is to give a huge amount of downtown street space over to the streetcars. That really makes a statement. And the merchants, it turns out, love the trams. It turns out they deliver far more people, far more efficiently to downtown than cars ever could. Here's an image of Clermont-Ferrand. The interesting thing about this one, Clermont-Ferrand is the hometown of Michelin, the tire manufacturer. So it makes sense that these things actually run on rubber tires. They're very quiet because that's a lot of the complaints you get in downtowns. The trams are noisy in historic centers. They run on a single guideway. And this picture doesn't really reflect the number of people that can be filling this square, thanks to the fact that they've kicked out lots of the cars and people are being delivered by trams. Now for me, there's nothing as glamorous as a big city metro system. I've always loved Paris's metro, and London's underground has its kind of smoky charms. But the one that really blew me away on this trip was Moscow's metro. Not for the trains, but for the stations. That one's called Komsomolskaya, which to me kind of looks like Liberace's basement ballroom if it had been designed by like master propagandists. Most of the stations on this line anyway, on the early lines, have these vast zals, these kind of baronial entrance halls. You take these very fast, very long escalators down to the zals, and the trains arrive on either side. The frequencies, the headways are incredible on this system, sometimes 90 seconds between trains. The Moscow Metro was explicitly designed as a way of elevating the everyday citizen. It's transit with a thesis, I'll be the first to admit that, and one of the only systems that has splendor engineered right into it. And Muscovites, I discovered, because I talked to a lot of them, still love their old Stalinist system. When everything is gridlocked on the streets up above, as it often is, they have horrendous traffic jams. It's one of the only things in Moscow that keeps on working. It continues to grow, too. Here's the recently opened Dostoevskaya station, named after the great Russian writer. This has surely got to be one of the only transit stops in the world that has a wall mural of a would-be nihilist axe-murdering a pawnbroker. Go figure, Russia. In my travels, I also saw a lot of examples of what I'll call bad glamour. Transit that, while it might seem cool and sexy and shiny, doesn't really do much for the people of the city it serves. So here are a few examples of what, for lack of a better term, I'll call transit fails. This is Phoenix's light rail system, Metro. Remember, I'm speaking as an amateur observer, a connoisseur maybe of these things, but not a professional. But in my opinion, the problem with this system, which covers about 20 miles, costs $1.4 billion, is not the streetcars themselves. They're really nice. They're wonderful. They're Japanese-made, spacious, and air-conditioned, lovely, cutting-edge street railway technology. So why does light rail in Phoenix fail while it succeeds in places like Strasbourg, and I'd argue here in Portland? For one simple reason. Phoenix is a city that was formed almost completely after the coming of the automobile. There is no real walking city at its center, never has been, which means the streetcars spend most of their time rumbling past surface parking lots and dry riverbeds, and because it's a desert, cacti and tumbleweeds occasionally. Don't get me wrong, I do love the experience of riding the metro system or the streetcar system in Phoenix. I was glad it was there. But this kind of transit is spectacularly ill-suited to a sprawled city like Phoenix. And the evidence is in the ridership. It carries about 46,000 passengers a day now, which isn't bad for a Sunbelt city, but you really have to compare it to heavy hauling systems. And many people will say this is an unfair comparison. The Lexington line carries that number of passengers every 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes. And admittedly, the Lexington line goes through very dense neighborhoods, and it helped create some of that density. Here's another transit fail, the Sydney monorail, Exhibit B. Its snakes are used to snake between the skyscrapers in the central business district through Darling Harbor, operating in a one-way loop. It's molasses slow, it's expensive, and it rarely intersects with buses and commuter rail. Fortunately, Sydney realized how useless it was, and last year they tore it down. It's being replaced with light rail. For me, the Sydney monorail, like Detroit's poorly implemented SkyTrain technology, Las Vegas's bankrupt monorail, are nothing more than glorified people movers, like the ones they have at Disneyland. What a city that's really serious, once again in my opinion, about keeping itself moving has to do is think hard about the kind of transit mode that best fits its urban form. An example I really like is Perugia's mini metro. Now, at first glance, this looks like just another people mover, a Disney-style people mover. But it's actually a form of transit that's ideally suited to the little hill town that it serves. Perugia used to be besieged by tourists and cars and tour buses. They have a fantastic summer festival season. They have a great medieval castle on the hilltop, and they're the home of those little Baci chocolates. That's where they make the Baci chocolates. So it's a nice medieval hill town. They decided to solve the problem of congestion in the center by closing the center to car traffic, except for residents, and implementing this mini metro. These little driverless cars, they're run by cable, carry about 25 people each maximum. They run at frequencies of about 90 seconds, believe it or not. So they can carry about 8,000 people an hour. And it's not just for carrying tourists from parking lots to the center. It's for delivering people all over town. So shoppers use it, to pick up their groceries. People drop off their kids at school with it. The mini metro has, by removing traffic from the center of Perugia, reinvigorated something else that's key to Italian life and that I experienced last time I was in Italy, the passeggiata, which is the great tradition of the evening stroll around 5 to 7. All of a sudden, people pour into the center of the city just to stroll because they can and because it's not besieged by cars. Another example of transit that I really like and that is quite unusual is the mid-levels escalators in Hong Kong. These are 20-linked escalators. They go down in the morning and up half a mile in the afternoon, passing apartments and bubble tea shops and mahjong parlors. Here you can kind of see them on the side there. They kind of cascade down through mid-levels. The only time they don't run, of course, is during typhoons. Here's another similar example in another city on a different continent. This is Medellin in Colombia, which has turned an arduous 30-minute walk up the equivalent of a 28-story building into an easy 5-minute ride. In both the case of Hong Kong and Medellin, these are solutions that I think are uniquely suited to urban morphology and density. I'm showing you these to emphasize that transit isn't always about subways or buses or light rail. It's about mobility. But mobility has to be matched with artistry and imagination to the city you're bringing it to. It's not just about slapping the latest technology, a billion-dollar monorail, on a city. That's just a waste of money. Of course, not everybody lives in an Umbrian hill town or a hyper-dense South American city. In the United States, it's been estimated that 45% of the population lives in small towns, central cities, or older suburbs that can, in theory at least, be served by transit. The reality is, though, that by area, 80% of metropolitan areas are suburban in character. And a lot of them, especially in the West and American South, look like this. That's an extreme example, admittedly. You'll notice all the cul-de-sacs, the loops and lollipops. It's a landscape that seems to be singularly resistant to transit. Buses have a terrible time penetrating. Some people think that this kind of sprawl can be repaired, that density can be introduced with multifamily dwellings, that strip malls and shopping centers can be repurposed. Here in Portland, Orenco Station, which I visited and wrote about in my book, is a very interesting example. It was an attempt to reconfigure the suburbs. I wasn't entirely impressed when I visited. A lot of the people I talked to said that they were not walking to state, they were not using the MAX to get to work. They were, of course, going to the Intel campus and usually taking their cars. They were riding the MAX to go downtown occasionally to get to the airport. I understand that a lot more density has been introduced around the station since I visited, which is a step in the right direction. I think that in the United States and Canada, what we really have to be doing is looking at the low-hanging fruit. A lot of our energies would be well advised to be devoted to the old neighborhoods in the central cities, often the ones that were formed by historic transit networks, streetcar suburbs I'm talking about essentially, as they used to be called. But that's no excuse to give up on the suburbs or the exurbs. And some metropolitan areas that I saw in my travels have been grappling with this problem. And the one that impressed me most was Bogota in Colombia. A couple of visionary mayors launched Transmilenio. This is their bus rapid transit system, and it's one of the best in the world. It relies on fast-loading, articulated buses running in, this is key, in dedicated lanes. They operate like subways on the street. Here's a good example of what a typical station looks like running along one of the major boulevards. You can see they have sort of North American style highways, but they've located these in the central area. They have these stations where 5 or 6 buses can be pulling up at any one time. They have express lanes like the New York subway, so they actually skip stops. It's incredibly heavy hauling. Some of the big buses, the bi-articulados, are as long as a 737 and can carry as many as 270 passengers. You'll notice how the doors are up high. That's because they mesh with platforms. When the buses pull abreast of these stations, the doors open, people just shuffle on like they were getting into an elevator. Transmilenio achieves the heavy hauling capacity of a subway at a fraction of the cost of heavy rail. It has also revolutionized transport in a city that used to rely on a chaotic and extremely dangerous system of private busetas. These are tiny little buses, and they basically go along the street trolling for passengers and then leaving the center when they're full. That system still exists in a lot of South American cities. It still exists in Bogota as well. And it turns major streets into parking lots, especially at rush hour. When I was there, the Transmilenio system, was overcrowded, and there was talk of building a subway. It's very political down there. But most Bogotanos I talked to favored expanding and improving Transmilenio. A crucial aspect of the system, and why I believe its success can be applied to American cities, is the way that these heavy hauling buses seamlessly mesh with feeder buses on the outskirts of town. So once you're off of the red or the yellow bus, the big ones, you walk out of the station area, but you're still in a fare paid zone, and you just walk on to these buses, which go out into the quite sprawled suburbs of Bogota. Toronto does this very well, and Toronto's reputation now has been spread far and wide and tarnished far and wide by the antics of its mayor, Rob Ford, but it actually has a pretty good transit system. It's got a sort of a 2.5-line subway system, but once you're out of the subway, you mesh up with little buses that deliver people to the suburbs very well, with free body transfers, as they call them. I think a lot of cities in the United States could use similar systems. Everyone talks about light rail, it's sexy, I like it a lot, I love riding it. But the low-hanging fruit for a lot of cities would be considering some form of bus rapid transit. Of course, building transit that works takes a lot of money, but what's the alternative? Continuing with a demonstrably unsustainable transportation system that has all kinds of public health consequences. I'm talking about the automobile. Building new roads and freeways we know and have long known is no solution to the problem of gridlock. That quote, by the way, is from The City in History, 1961, by the great urbanist and architecture critic Lewis Mumford. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine, if you can imagine an urbanist on the cover of Time magazine, or even when Time magazine was an important cultural artifact. I don't know why he looks like he's about to go paddle off into the great North Woods when he should be sort of in Greenwich Village. He is one of my urbanism gurus. And here are a couple of more that I think that everybody who's interested in transportation and the future of the city should read. First of all, Peter Norton, key in the research of my book. His book, The Scholarly but Gripping Fighting Traffic, is the best single-volume history of how automobile interests, starting in the 1920s, claimed streets from the citizens who had been using them since time immemorial. Actually, I'm exaggerating. It's time memorial. Cities have been around. Urban history has existed for at least 7,000 years, back to the days of Hayuk in Turkey, an artisan's village, which is considered the first city. Cars have been in our cities for about 90 years. Pedestrians have seniority. The late Paul Mees of Melbourne, whose Transport for Suburbia offers a very sound analysis of the shortcomings of transit in North America, and I think offers real solutions for how to improve it. Of course, UCLA's Donald Shoup, who has rightfully singled out the surfeit of free parking on this continent as being a fertility drug for sprawl. The United States apparently spends, according to his calculations, spends $347 billion a year subsidizing parking. That's all out of the taxpayers' money. I'm sure there are people here who will dispute that figure, but I find it impressive. Last but not least, the guy who gave me gold as eggs yesterday, Jarrett Walker, who I think writes one of the sanest and most readable blogs on transit around human transit. His principles are very clearly communicated, and that's an important thing, communicating these ideas to the public. Now listen, I don't think cars are going to go away anytime soon. They are very useful machines. I'm the first to admit it. But the reality is, and I don't know if you saw this in the Oregonian, yesterday, vehicle miles traveled have been declining in Oregon since 2004, in the United States since around that time. They're not in free fall, but they are declining for the first time in history. Millennials, cars are no longer what they used to be for previous generations. About half of American teenagers now say they'd rather have internet access than a car. That's an amazing statistic. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I was kind of coming of age in the 80s. It was the time of Bruce Springsteen. I was reading Jack Kerouac, that kind of thing. A car was freedom. I talk to kids today. That's no longer the case. Personally, I see car use on this continent going the way it's already gone in Japan and Northern Europe. People there might own cars, but they don't use them for day-to-day commuting. They use them for trips to the country, to visit the in-laws, to move furniture, or in some cases to go to those big Swedish furniture stores on the edge of town. I admit to being guilty to that. The reality is, in North America, 30% of citizens just can't drive. Very important, and something that's forgotten. They're too old, they're too young, or they have some kind of disability. I'm always shocked when I visit car-centric cities. Almost 1 in 3 of their citizens are excluded from the dominant transportation system. That's why I believe that anybody who is going into transportation planning should, as part of his or her training, be required to spend at least a week navigating a major city without a car. I've been doing it all my life, and now I'm doing it pushing a stroller around with my 2-year-old son or carrying him on my bicycle seat. And you learn a lot about your city. You learn a lot about obstacles to mobility. Even in a relatively transit-oriented city like Montreal, I'm constantly encountering problems like non-existent escalators or broken escalators in metro stations, a complete lack of sidewalks in some suburbs. But the biggest obstacle is a presumption that every citizen has access to a car. It's just not true. So where does a city that wants to change itself, to change its DNA, which has already been set in its street form in a lot of cases, where does a city begin? Perhaps the easiest thing I believe a city can do is change its relationship that its people have to the street. And that doesn't take much. You can start by doing what they did back in Bogota in the early 90s to pave the way for Transmilenio. They set up this thing called ciclovia, which still continues. Every Sunday, every major holiday, for the entire day, they shut down hundreds of miles of street and open them and they open them up to citizens. It's actually a wonderful event. There's sort of, you can't see it here, but there's like corn grilling on the side of the street. The city sets up bicycle repair stands along the way. There's cooling stations for people. This is in the city that used to be considered the most dangerous in the Western Hemisphere, by the way. People pour into the streets, walking and riding bikes. And the Bogotanos I talked to said that ciclovia was a thing that really changed their relationship to the streets. Los Angeles is experimenting with this. They have their own ciclovia. I don't think it's implemented well enough right now. You really need to be ambitious when you do this kind of thing. People started to see the streets as places for people to gather, for lovers to stroll, for families to enjoy, and as places where cars were seen as intruders, key. Or you do what they've done on Broadway in New York with the famous Janet Sadek Con, or the Stroll. I'm probably butchering my Danish there, but this is now the longest car-free shopping street in the world. They started doing this in the 70s. When you pedestrianize a street like this, people pour into the new space as if by magic. That's what they found in New York when I talked to Janet Sadek Khan. She said it was amazing. People were just poured into the new spaces on Broadway as if they'd been dying for them. All of these are extremely effective ways to remind people that city streets, before they were thoroughfares for cars, were places where life was lived and children played. New York, 1900. London, the 1960s, when there was a large network of play streets, where mechanized transportation, as they say here, mechanically propelled vehicles were prohibited during the day. And that's an initiative that's returning to England, by the way. So on my trip around the world, I saw all kinds of transport vehicles. Strangely enough, though, it was the simplest ones that's really stuck with me. Here's one I love and I'll never forget, the mamachari. The mommy bike. These are ubiquitous in Japan. And the interesting thing is you don't really see them in the central cities. You see them in the suburbs. These are the station wagons of Japan. They're cheap department store bikes. This one's kind of a fancy model, but a lot of the ones you see cost no more than the equivalent of $100. And these are the way that dad gets to work, mom does her shopping, mom gets to work increasingly in Japan. And they're something that the Japanese don't even think about, oddly enough. They don't even notice them anymore. There's so many bikes around the stations, but they're a key part of a multimodal transportation system. Here's another one that people don't think about, that I think are really important. You've probably been stuck behind one of these on the pavement somewhere in your travels. The little cloth-lined shopping bags that are ubiquitous in Europe. It's one factor, along with multi-story apartment buildings, that means that people in Europe tend to be fitter later into life and less obese. It's another part of a multimodal transportation system. Finally, here's one that I hope to own one day myself. I kind of fell in love with transportation in Copenhagen, which has very good public transportation, but also has something called the cargo bike. This is I think this is a Nihola is the brand, a wonderful brand. They're expensive. That's kind of status symbols, the equivalent of $3,000 to $4,000. As I mentioned, I have a 2-year-old son, and I'm shopping around for one of these. 25% of families in Denmark, with 2 or more kids, own one of these things. They can carry up to 3 kids. The cargo bays are quite big, or a week's worth of groceries. They're essentially the SUVs of Denmark. Even the Crown Prince rides one proudly and carries his kids around. For me, the cargo bike embodies an idea I like to think of as slow transport. While high-speed trains and the latest LRT systems have their place, I'm beginning to appreciate the fact that in terms of quality of life, you're better off if you don't have to spend a huge part of your day stuck in traffic, just trying to get to work or school or back home. After all, why go zipping around in a car if you actually like the place you live? Which is why everybody who considers him or herself an urbanist or a transportation professional needs to be asking a very important question. Why aren't we building ourselves streets and neighborhoods and cities that we want to linger in rather than escape from? Follow me on Twitter, I implore you. And here's a list of some of the books I mentioned. I'm going to leave them up on the screen. I know I wasn't expected to be giving you homework of any kind, and nobody's required, and you probably all know these books. One I should add is the great Danish urbanist Jan Gehl's Life Between Buildings, sort of an essential read. I interviewed him for the book. I interviewed many other people for the book that became Straphanger, which is available at a table in the back, and I'll be around for a few minutes with my arm in the air, pretending I'm still commuting. Anyways, do I have time to take a couple of questions, or? Yeah? What time is it?
It is 1:20.
Okay, perfect.
Have one.
Uh-oh.
And that would be your opinion of the bus rapid transit system in Ottawa.
Yeah, the transitways in Ottawa, set up very early on the continent in the 1980s. It was interesting, the Embark, I don't know if you know them, they kind of rate bus rapid transit around the world. They have a gold, silver, and bronze standard. Nothing in North America gets a gold. That's all reserved for their, you know, it's a developing world conspiracy, that organization. But the only one that comes close, is oddly enough, is the Cincinnati Health Line. It used to be called the Health Line. Sorry? Oh, it's a Cleveland, right, yeah. It's a silver, and it used to be called the Health Line.
It's a Health Line, they got the silver.
And they got the silver, right. But Ottawa's is interesting. I spent a year in Ottawa, 1 decade, and it's a hell of a town. I use the system quite often. It's improving a little bit. My problem is that the buses work in mixed traffic a lot of the time. When they're on the transit ways, they roll all right, but there is not enough enforcement of prepayment along the way. There aren't really separated lanes in the downtown. I think when you roll out bus rapid transit, you've got to, do it right and get all of the essentials. And Embark has laid out a lot of, and the people in Bogota have laid out a lot of the principles for good bus rapid transit.
I see a question here. John does have a microphone now.
Why aren't driverless cars going to just encourage more carless drivers by making car sharing universal?
Well, they might do that. There's a great Walt Disney animated short from the 1950s that I like to tweet about called Magic Highway that envisions this wonderful world where people will be using driverless cars, they'll be doing conferences in the back, and there's a great animation where the car goes into an office building, goes up on an exterior elevator, and the narrator jokes, and maybe even father will have to walk a few feet to get to his desk. Nudge, nudge. I don't know what the future is. They might well pull that vision of the future off. I shudder to think of it. I'm not going to be in any city where autonomous cars are running around, and I'm going to do everything in my power to discourage that. That's not the kind of world I want my son growing up in. So, you know what? It might work out. I don't like them.
One last question right up here.
Did you visit any urban gondolas or aerial trams, especially in South America? Do you have any reflections on this?
No, I didn't actually. The one city I went to, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. He was asking if I went to any of the favelas, like in Brazil, and Rio has some of these aerial trams. I know that some cities in the Muslim world are experimenting with them. I didn't. I think that they're a really good solution, a relatively low-cost solution for equity. Apparently, they can be made to work fairly well. My experience with gondolas has always been in tourist settings, so I have a kind of a penchant against them, but I'm very interested. There was even a proposal to do one in a suburb of Montreal and Laval, so I'm kind of following that story as it develops. It wasn't a chapter in the book.
Well, we'll have to take you on a Portland aerial tram.
Oh yeah, I forgot. I completely forgot about that. It's, and that serves a hospital, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, well, I have a couple more books to add to your collection.
I don't think they're going to let me back in Canada with all the stuff I got at Powell's. So I'm not.
And more. Now you have a bag for it.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks for the invitation.